Hey all, my name is Jemilis Gonzalez. I use he, him pronouns, and welcome to a University Heights Center, or also known as U Heights, and Resolution to End Homelessness Partnership interview podcast series, discussing the history, present nuances, and social aspects of vehicular residency. Thank you already for tuning in and spending your time with us.
Well, I'll start back here. I mean, it's kind of like blocked because I was sleeping, but I use out of there. The bed itself was made by my friends, and he gave me a memory foam mattress. So I've got that in here, and it's so comfortable. I use these, obviously, to block out. I found this, the college kids all dump all their stuff up here. And I found this little bamboo thing with a couple of drawers, and I liked it. I'm getting it. The thing that I was talking about, the little stand, is actually going to go here, and just going to get rid of all of this in here. But underneath my bed, I've got my tool bag is up there, but I got my jumper cables and everything. All my car things are all back here. And then up the front side, you can see my bed has got totes under there. I've got my dry food. I've got my medical things and my grooming and my toiletries. That's the word. Under my bed, I've got food, and my dishes are all up in my front seat. And I have a little drawer thing here for all my little knickknacks and things like that. Not knickknacks, but weird stuff, the catch-all.
This was Tamara's story and how she entered vehicle residency, in which she did out of means of survival. Following her story is Dr. Graham Press. Let's take a few minutes to listen in.
Right? Okay, well, I was married for lots and lots of years, twice. And after the second one, I went to Texas. I ran away from home, came back home, and I got up here, rented from somebody at Craigslist, rented from somebody else in Craigslist. I lost my job, went and stayed with my cousin, rented there for a year, went up north to a friend's and stayed for a year at his place in his camper. And then from there, I got shifted because brother needed the shelter there. So I was asked to make room for a relative, which I did, and I ended up in a women's shelter, women's shelter up in Mount Vernon. I was there for 2 months, and then on my way, my time ran out up there, and I lost my job up there, and so I was moved into my Honda. So from there, that was in 2015. And so then in 2016, I moved into my car, and then from there I moved into a Subaru, and then from a Subaru into my van. Yeah, I didn't have any problem helping you at all last night with that. That was cool. Yeah.
My name is Dr. Graham Press. I am a anthropologist, applied ethnoarchaeologist. I work at the University of California, San Francisco, at the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative, which is part of the Center for Vulnerable Populations at the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. I have been doing research with people who live in vehicles or vehicle residents for about the last decade. I began this research here in Seattle, in actually the North Seattle, Ballard area, because I knew a lot of people who were living in their vehicles, and a lot of what they were experiencing didn't match my own personal experiences of when I was homeless as a youth. And it also didn't match a lot of the stereotypes that I had come to learn about homelessness. In King County, roughly half of the homeless community, as it's referred to, is within emergency shelters, and the other half are living on the streets, or unsheltered, as they're referred to. And of that unsheltered community, roughly half of them live in vehicles. Since 2008, vehicle residency, if I remember correctly, has represented at least 30% of the unsheltered community, has gone as high as 50% in the last several years. And since 1998, I believe, has increased over 2,000%. So back in 1998, I believe that the reported numbers were around 115 people were living in vehicles, and this year it's somewhere around 3,500.
For context, the question asked was, why do people choose to live in vehicles?
It's I appreciate too the the caveat at the beginning, because it's not that I hate to answer the question; it's that the question's asked so often, and it's a question that I asked as well myself when I began this research. So it's a question I would like us to be able to answer ourselves, right? Because I think that we know the answers ourselves. That I choose my form of housing out of a constrained set of options, and that for people who choose to live in their vehicles, they choose in much the same ways that we all choose our housing, that they see that form of housing as generally the optimal form among the available options that they see before them. And so I think that the question of choice is an important question. It's just that I think that rather than using it as a way to sort of distinguish between maybe a deserving and an undeserving group of people who could use our help, that we should consider the question of choice as more of a reaffirmation of our mutual humanity. This person is making very much the same choice that we make when we choose our housing. We just have different options than they do. In general, there's an overrepresentation of people of color and veterans in our unhoused systems in total, and that's represented and mirrored within vehicle residents first and foremost. So I think that a lot of what we see among the vehicle resident community is a larger aspect of homelessness in America as we think about it. But also that, in particular, for vehicle residents, many vehicle residents are from disaffiliated groups, from groups that have historically had barriers put in their way to on property ownership, on equity development, on long-term intergenerational growth and wealth, on education, criminal justice barriers. And for many people of color, there's a lot of people who use the vehicle as a form of housing with all of those barriers in mind, because sort of the historic barriers have left this form of housing as sort of optimal. I met so many people who had criminal justice backgrounds, say a felony background or a sex offender background, in which you can't get into housing, you can't get a job if you have those backgrounds. People who had terminal health issues, and they couldn't find hospice care in the emergency shelter system because it's really good luck. No one's going to pay for you to unfortunately die, right? And so they would end up living in an RV in the last years of their life. You have people who are from the LGBTQ communities who feel discriminated against by certain religiously oriented services, particularly. You have groups all across the board that so many of people who are living in vehicles tend to be there because of this systemic disconnection from social services, from housing, from employment, from these larger disconnections. And so that the vehicle becomes this long-term housing, because where else you have to live somewhere, right? And ultimately, the person ends up living in their school bus or their van because the barriers are so intense around getting into an actual apartment. Part of the reason that societies like the United States and others like England and Ireland experience vehicle residency in the way they do is because of a history of colonization, specifically. That the policies of colonization that enclose open space to create private space for the capital development of housing and rental and resources and cheap labor markets, that history of that is the same policies that feed into Seattle today. And that the enclosing of the housing market in Seattle that displaced the person who used to live here on the Ave is the same extension of that policies that displaced the travelers 500 years ago. And so in that larger sense, the concept of the savage, of the nomad, of the displaced person who is assumed to be displaced on their own will is a way of obscuring the responsibility of colonialism. And so I think that we cannot let that go. That one of the reasons why we see so many non-white male, necessarily people who are in that dominant white male structure that's often of colonialism, in living in vehicles and experiencing homelessness on the whole, is because the processes that create that of displacement and then that put the onus of displacement on the person who's displaced is part of a white male patriarchy of supremacy that is part of colonialism. So I think that's one of the reasons why women who are fleeing domestic violence tend to live in vehicles and hide in vehicles for quite a long time, because they don't have a lot of support and protection in systems that are often run by white men. The lingering effects and the continuing effects of colonialism are a tremendous determinant on the ability of services that people who are non-white are able to receive and in our society. In truth, the universe is one big whole, and the concept of privatizing land has a history. But because we live in a society which has it so deeply embedded, this idea that privatization is normal and right, we don't often consider the history of that, and that it's not a natural thing, and it might not be being done the perfect way, right? And that by allowing an unchecked privatization of colonialism, you get very much the same things that we see in Seattle, of this unchecked enclosure of the housing market. And so by people being able to buy up pieces of land, not rent them out or rent them at such a high rate that nobody can afford them, it's this continuing process of displacement that helps to create capital. The amount of people that I've met who are postal workers, who are working at Amazon, who are fully employed, who are, and like I said, the reason why I started this work, because it was my friends who were living in my neighborhood who were living in vehicles, and they didn't match what I knew about homelessness. Right? And I think that there's an interesting, you mentioned this idea of the new face of homelessness, which is this term that comes up about every 30 years or so, honestly, right? Because we had this new face of homelessness in the 1980s in the United States, and it was, at the time, it was the middle class. Actually, a lot of it was sort of turning from what had been the old face of homelessness, which was the idea of the hobo, the tramp, right, and sort of the Depression era, scruffy guy with the bindle sack or whatever. And it's interesting when we think about what that means, because I just want to take a sec to think about what the old face and the new face and what we're seeing differently. Currently in the United States, well, pre-COVID, right? We don't know what the numbers are going to be after COVID, to be honest, but pre-COVID in the United States, around 500,000 people were experiencing homelessness on any given night, 560,000, somewhere around there, out of a population of, correct me if I'm wrong, around 300 million. I think you'd have to remember, somewhere around there in the United States. And in the 1920s, in the times leading up to the Depression, there were around 2 million people who were experiencing homelessness in this country out of a population of around 125 million. So it's like 10 times as much back then as we experience now. So it's not to say that we're not in a crisis, because obviously we are, and we can see the tremendous amount of need around us. It's to say that we as a society have seen homelessness on the level that we're seeing now and much more. And if you ask people of that age, you may hear a grandparent who talks about hobos who used to come to the back door and they would ask for potatoes or something. My grandmother tells these stories. And it was not uncommon that happened. The reality is that there wasn't a word for homeless back then. Those were traveling, itinerant, low-income laborers. They did not have a home because they could not afford a home. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now is very much the same. And we need to understand how even what we think of as homelessness acts as a barrier to our understanding of that individual. That what we're seeing are displaced people. We're seeing people who've been knocked out of their economy, people who have been separated from our society. And because of that, because of these larger economic forces at play, they're living in our communities in public space, right? And our thought of the safe parking programs address this so perfectly. The idea of homelessness denies the capacity of homemaking to that individual, because all human beings make homes. And if we call that person homeless, we deny their home and we deny their ability to call that home. Right? And so I know that it's a term, we have to have some term that we use. So I'm not saying we should all go use houseless or whatever the next term is, but to recognize that, and maybe this is something to take forward, to think about, where do our own biases around what we consider fit and unfit versions of home block our understanding of our neighbors, our understanding of the forces at play? What is it that displaced that person? How do we experience those same forces, right? So that, again, kind of getting this question of why do people choose to live in their home? Why do I choose to live in my home? Right? And instead of seeing that as something that separates us, something that actually more reaffirms how we're all part of this same system, and that the forces that you see and the difficulties that you see in the housing market around you, the forces of displacement you see at play, are many of the reasons why that person is living on the streets.
It is important and urgent to recognize that our many definitions of what it means to have a home is not a monolith, but rather individualized. And it must be asked first, while working with people who are displaced, what do you want and or need to acquire appropriate shelter for you?
And along the way, I have changed my thinking about the whole thing as poor, pitiful me being homeless. Now I am, oh, wow, I am not having to pay anybody rent anymore. I am not homeless. I am rent-free. For the first time in my adult life, I am rent-free. And at that point, then I started refocusing toward my goals, which are to finish getting my van geared up and start go traveling.
Thank you for joining us for episode 1 in our exploration of vehicle residency. In episode 2, we will learn about safe parking programs and how they support vehicle residents in accessing services and resources, avoiding criminalization, and gaining stability. We will hear from Maureen, Executive Director of U Heights, which is a host site for one of King County's few safe parking programs, and Graham Press, who will discuss the benefits of safe parking and their shared experience. Until next time.